We're really excited this month because we know this is a really important topic of interest that our attendees have asked about many times over. And we're really appreciative of our partner, AHC Inc., who is a nonprofit affordable housing developer working in our region. They just rebranded themselves as Affordable Homes and Communities. So congratulations to them on the rebrand and their new strategic plan and amazing goals that they've set out for themselves and their partners. And we appreciate their opportunity to kind of dig a little deeper with them into affordable housing finance by focusing on one particular affordable housing community, the Terraces at Arlington View East. This redeveloped site now includes 77 newly constructed apartment homes in South Arlington along the eastern side of Columbia Pike. The Terraces at Arlington View is really just one affordable community of many that have been opened in Northern Virginia over the past 12 months, which has really helped us to kind of move toward our regional housing goals. And we're really fortunate to have a team from AHC here today. Ken Crawford, AHC's Chief Operating Officer, Alan Goldstein, the Vice President of Real Estate Development, and Josh Childs, the Development Manager on this project. They're a fantastic team. And I invited Ken here because he has taught many affordable housing finance courses throughout his career. And I know he will make this often dry and complicated topic much more understandable and entertaining. So thank you, Ken, for kind of agreeing to be our lead presenter here. And thank you, Josh, for helping as well with the presentation. As we've all seen since we started doing these lunch and learns, is that we have a lot of requests for more training and education and information on affordable housing finance. And this specific training, we got more pre-questions than any other lunch and learn that we've held. So we know there's an appetite to learn more. So with only an hour, I do want to recognize that we're probably not going to get to all of your questions, but we're working on how we can continue the education and learning on this topic. So I am going to turn it over to Ken and Josh to give their presentation. I hope many of the questions will be answered in the presentation, but we will have time for Q&A. You can go ahead and add your questions to the chat at any time, or you can raise your hand after his presentation and we'll call on you. But welcome, so glad you're here joining Northern Virginia Affordable Housing Alliance, and thank you, Ken and Josh.
Excellent. So good day, everyone. Again, my name is Ken Crawford. I'm with AHC as the Chief Operating Officer here. Full disclosure, I've been here for a grand total of 3 months. So I am new to the team. I want to thank very specifically Josh and Alan, who are teammates that were actually down in the trenches of Terraces over the last several years. But in talking to Jill, recognizing that we wanted to talk about an individual project here in Arlington, we chose Terraces, but given the fact that what we're trying to do is really kind of talk in the macro to some degree about affordable housing development in particular, and it's something that I'm incredibly passionate about. I've been doing this for, I don't know, 25 years, something like that. I was a financier, I was an equity investor, and I've been a developer for the last 8 years or so. So bring a lot of different points of view to the table, and really excited about trying to give you guys some concept of the work that we do. So let's see if we could go to the next slide. So just real quick on AHC, this is the plug that everybody does, but AHC has been around for 50 years. We have 54 assets in the portfolio. It is a nonprofit real estate development company that puts our tenants at the center of everything that we do here. We're very, very resident focused, and we have excellent programs on the resident services side of the house. Unfortunately, we don't have them on every single property, but it is a standing goal that we ultimately will, over time, bring resident services to the entire portfolio, and every transaction that we do going forward will include resident services. Putting a roof over someone's head is a fundamental thing that a real estate development company does, but ultimately having a solid community with solid opportunities, solid education, a safe environment, all of those things are wicked important in creating community. We're going to talk about a project called Terraces East. It's here in Arlington County. This is actually, this particular project was part of a larger site, and we'll see another slide that we can talk about that. But ultimately, what we ended up producing here was 77 new homes, all affordable, 100% affordable at 60% AMI, which is area median income or below. The project was 100% universal design. There's free residential Wi-Fi in the building. There were a number of green aspects to the transaction, rooftop solar, a green roof, and then also the site does have a community room as well as on-site resident services manager space as well. So that's just kind of the big picture. So just again, trying to give some context for the site for this particular project. If you see the green line around the entire site, that is what made up Arlington Terraces originally. This was a project that it was one of the first projects that AHC actually purchased in 1982. In the year 2001, there was a tax credit transaction that was financed to do a rehabilitation. After coming out of the 15-year hold period, there was the desire to start the process of redeveloping the site. So where you see the red star in the site, that is actually the parcel that we developed with the new Terraces project for 77 units. The entire site originally had 77 units on it, and there was a project-based Section 8 contract for the entire 77 units. The building that was actually taken down was only 30 units, and we were able to design a new building that increased the density on this particular site from 30 units to 77 units. So as I said, there was a project-based Section 8 contract on the entire site. We'll touch on a little bit the complexity of taking an existing HAP agreement and splitting it apart, and taking 30 units of the original 77 and applying the HAP contract to 30 of our new 77 units. There's working with HUD sometimes can be somewhat challenging. The paperwork's challenging. The process for approvals can be a little bit challenging, but we were able to separate it and apply 30 units to the new project, and we still have 47 units on the remainder of the site, which will ultimately at some point in the future be redeveloped. Okay, so now what I want to do is start out with some really basic concepts with regard to real estate development. One of the things that I often find when I'm talking to people about real estate development is everyone always has the belief that real estate itself is a way to get rich. It is a way that people generate cash flow and generate value, which I would suggest in for-profit real estate development work, that's exactly why people get into real estate. And I use just a visual that I'd like to show what I think is just a very simple demonstration of the difference between for-profit real estate development work and affordable housing real estate development work. So this line here, this line here is going to be my operating expenses. In for-profit real estate development work, what we do is we try to increase the revenue over the operating expenses to the greatest extent that we can. That's what the market will bear. So you charge rents to the greatest extent you possibly can. The difference between here and here, that in a real estate transaction generates cash flow, and it also generates value. And it's those two components that a for-profit real estate developer is going to pull out of the real estate. And that's why people really are keen to do real estate development work. So if this is the basic concept on for-profit real estate development work, so let me show you what we do on the affordable side. So on the affordable side, what we're trying to do is reduce rents to the greatest extent that we can in an effort to make them affordable. So if this is my maximizing rents in the for-profit development work, this is what we try to do in the affordable world, is trying to reduce rents to the point that they can be affordable to people of low and moderate income. As you can see in this particular scenario, you don't generate a lot of cash flow, and the value ultimately that gets generated is through a number of the tax credits and some of the lending programs that help us develop affordable housing. So it's a really fundamental difference between for-profit and affordable housing economics. Okay, affordable housing real estate development work it's complicated, it takes a long period of time, and it's expensive. Honestly, that's not far different from for-profit real estate development work. But I will say that in the affordable space, the timelines and the financing tend to be even longer in the affordable space. So what I'm showing here is a timeline for this particular project, Terraces. The project had come out of year 15, and it took a period of time for the organization to figure out what they wanted to do on the redevelopment side of the house. But in 2018, they began in earnest with looking at the project and trying to figure out what could be done on the particular site that they decided they wanted to redevelop. At that point, they have to look at zoning, they have to look at entitlements, they have to look at the financing that might be out there. And it's at that point that you're also going to engage with the initial set of professionals. Usually it starts within an organization where you're going to look at your assets, or you're going to look at the opportunity, and you're going to start to do some back of the envelope work on what you might be able to do on the site, i.e. the number of units you might be able to produce. Then you have to think through what type of units you want to produce, 1, 2, 3, 4 bedrooms, and to think through partially what income levels you're going to try to target in your redevelopment. So once you do some just back of the envelope kind of work, then you've got to sit down with professionals to think through how you can actually take some of those initial ideas and actually put them on a piece of paper and ultimately get them approved. And that's where you engage with an architect, you engage with engineers, you engage with the general contractor. More than likely, you're going to be doing some preliminary work with the property management company and or your own internal asset management side of the house to do the initial understanding of what you're trying to produce. Once you figure out how much you can build, the form and structure of what the building is going to be, you've done some back of the envelope kind of mathematics on what the finances are, you then have to go through the whole process of putting the financing together. So in 2018, where we talked about the initial study, design, and development kickoff, that's a lot of preliminary work. As it turns out, in 2019, almost the entire year of 2019, AHC went through the whole zoning process. And it took almost an entire year to get through the zoning process in 2019. And then it was in 2020 that we actually got the zoning approval. You have to have zoning approval and basically a site plan approval, plus or minus, at that point to be able to then try to move forward with financing. So if I wrote it down in my notes. So at this point, even before we get ready to do our tax credit applications, we are basically 2 years into the development process by this point. So in 2019, or I'm sorry, in 2020, we applied for 9% credits. In affordable housing, usually the vehicle for financing affordable housing tends to be one of two programs, either the 9% tax credit or the 4% tax credit. The 9% tax credit is driven by each and every state has what's called a qualified allocation plan, which will dictate the terms and conditions under which they will give out credits to a developer in order to do a piece of work. The 4% tax credit is a little bit different in the sense that 4% tax credits are associated with bonds. Bonds are a financing method. It basically is debt, and by virtue of tax-exempt bonds being issued, along with those tax-exempt bonds are 4% tax credits. The 4% tax credit is less valuable because you don't get as many credits versus the 9%. The 9% tax credits, typically speaking, you're going to get or not typically, you're always going to get more tax credits when you go through the 9% tax credit process. The 9% tax credit process is an incredibly competitive process. The state of Virginia in particular has a lot of very clear bells and whistles as to what they're looking for in a real estate development project. We as developers will look at the QAP and determine how we're going to approach our development in light of the bells and whistles that the Housing Finance Agency sets up. And by virtue of the choices that we make, our application can be more competitive or less competitive. As it turns out, our tax credit application was highly competitive, and we were awarded tax credits. And ultimately, once you're awarded your with your tax credit application, there are going to be other pieces of financing that you will have previously talked to various jurisdictions to see what kind of funds may be available. And when we look at the sources and uses, we're going to talk about a few of those. The other, let's see, what else do we want to talk about with regard to timeline? So you apply for your tax credits. Ultimately, your tax credits are sized up against everybody else's projects that are out there. And ultimately, they award a certain number of tax credits to a few of the projects that are submitted. I've been doing this work for a long period of time. I will say in the early years of the program, there were instances where the tax credit allocation was not fully subscribed. In today's world, with the sophistication of the tax credit market and the number of people that are trying to do affordable housing projects, I will say that the number of applications that come in versus the number of applications that are approved, it's 5, 6, 7 times greater, the applications versus the actual approvals. So you can see that it is a very, very competitive process, and it is a resource that is in great demand. Let's see. So once you have your tax credit application or your tax credit award, then you actually start the process of pulling together all of the final pieces of the transaction. So we've gotten our tax credit allocation, and so let's talk a little bit about sources and uses. So sources are all the money that you're going to raise in order to cover the cost of all of the aspects of doing a transaction. I'm going to talk about uses first. So as you can see, we have acquisition. And acquisition, that is actually the price that was paid for the land in this transaction. The land cost is about 6% of the total development costs in this particular example, about almost $30,000 per unit. One of the elements of a lot of affordable housing work is, to the extent that you can get land at as low a cost basis as you possibly can, that's a real benefit. That's why oftentimes, real estate development companies are looking to work with jurisdictions that have land, that they have land bank for some reason, in an effort to access some of that land, ideally at a lower cost basis. The next line is the hard cost construction. Hard cost construction is, or hard cost of the transaction is going to be the greatest expense in the transaction. This makes up about 70% of the total development cost here, coming in at about $366,000 per unit, which is, depending upon how you look at it, that might be expensive to some, not expensive to others. I will say some of the historic work that I've done, a price point below that is possible, although it's getting harder and harder in today's world. I will say, having done work on both in the Northeast as well as out in California, I've seen transactions where you see the total development costs that are above $600,000, $700,000, $800,000 a unit, which is kind of crazy. Thankfully, we're not there in our market here. The rest of the capital, or the rest of the uses, include soft costs, and that's where you're going to pay all your professionals, your architect, your engineer, all the studies that need to be done, are all taken care of in soft costs. Typically speaking, in a low-income housing tax credit deal, you're going to have to actually fund reserves. Reserves can include replacement reserves, operating reserves. In some instances, there can be other types of debt. There can be debt service reserves. There can be, depending upon the underwriting, other reserves could be created. In this particular transaction, this represents operating reserves. For sure, the number seems relatively high, and we'll get back to on some details on that one. Development fee. So when I talked earlier about the idea of the difference between affordable housing development and for-profit real estate development, when the low-income housing tax credit was originally designed, recognizing the limited cash flow and the limited value that gets generated from a real estate point of view, one of the things that they did is that they made part of the Section 42 law the concept that a developer could earn up to a 15% development fee. And the reason why they did that was because if the real estate is not generating cash flow and value, what is the motivator for a developer to do this work? The motivator is the development fee. I will say that early on in my career, most of the development fees that were being paid originally were a full 15%. I will say, over time, as the market became more and more competitive, and as housing finance agencies recognize the value of the tax credit and the competitive nature of the tax credit, development fees have actually been coming down from that, what is statutorily allowed, which is 15%. Those development fees have come down over time. And I will say that, like in this particular transaction, the development fee here is 7% of the total development cost. And at $2.8 million, that's not chump change. That being said, when we get through the rest of the timeline, which is, getting to closing, getting constructed, getting leased up, getting to conversion, which is going to be another 2 years, we will have spent almost 4 years in this transaction. And the development fee that gets paid for 4 years of work, and then for a 15-year hold period, it's not as substantial a number as you would think. And then the last item on the uses side is financing and construction loan interest. That this is all the financing costs, it's points, it's interest, it's some of the legal and prep work that needs to go into a transaction. So when you add all this up, we're at $41.7 million in total development costs. And then the question becomes, okay, how do you finance $41 million? There are 2 pieces of financing in a transaction that are relatively easy to figure out. The first one is the permanent loan amount. The permanent loan amount, when we get to the income statement, I'll explain to you how you back into what the permanent loan amount is. But essentially, you charge rents. Against the rents, you have to pay operating expenses. After that, you have what's called net operating income. A senior lender, a hard money lender, is going to expect a debt service coverage ratio of at least 1.15 times revenue to the debt service coverage, or to the debt service. So you can actually back into what your first mortgage is going to be. So of a $41.7 million total development cost transaction, I now, by virtue of mathematics, can back into what my permanent loan is going to be, which is $10.6 million. The second piece of what we can do is calculate what the tax credit equity is going to be. Low-income housing tax credits, I use the phraseology that it's not rocket science, but there's a lot of nuance to it. I will say that our total uses here are $41.7 million. There is a concept that is called basis, which is the mathematics by which we derive the amount of tax credit equity that we can generate. So knowing what our uses are, again, there's a mathematical equation that you can go through that will determine the number of credits that the project could actually generate. So when we go in for a tax credit application, we know how many tax credits the project could generate. In the early days of the program, you would ask for as many credits as you possibly could, in order to generate as much equity as you could. But again, over time, as this program has become more and more competitive, there are limitations on the amount of credits. In many jurisdictions, there are limitations on the amount of credits that you can get. As it turns out, our basis in the project meant that we could have gotten almost $3 million annually of tax credits. As it turns out, when we went in for our application, we made a conscious choice not to ask for the maximum, but a lower amount, which actually turned out to be just over $2 million for the request of annual tax credits. So in theory, what we were doing is leaving money on the table from an equity point of view, But because of the process of tax credit, 9% tax credit applications, we asked for a lower amount of credits, which made us more competitive, which ultimately made our application a winner. That being said, the amount of tax credits that we were allocated, and let's just for round numbers, put it at $2 million a year. Tax credits are delivered over a 10-year period. So 2 times 10 is $20 million. And what we do is then take those tax credits, go into the marketplace, and find an investor that's willing to buy the tax credits. So in this particular instance, I honestly, I should have it at my fingertips, but the price paid for the tax credits was less than $1. And typically speaking, in order for an investor to earn a return on their investment into the transaction, they're typically going to, if for $1 of tax credit they get, in order to get a return, they're going to pay a little bit less than $1. So in this particular instance, the price per tax credit was a little bit less than $1 per tax credit, ultimately generating $19.5 million worth of equity. So with those two numbers combined, the debt, the permanent debt, and the tax credit equity, I'm part of the way to financing my deal. The remaining sources that we have listed here are what I would originally define is the gap in a transaction. You have a first mortgage defined, tax credit equity defined, but in order to get to $41.7 million, I've now got this gap that I have to solve for. And this is what I always say, that our development side of the house that goes out and does this work, this is how they earn their stripes. I was a military guy. That's how you earn your stripes, by going out and finding soft money. As it turns out, this is a, I wouldn't say it's overly complicated, but it's a pretty complicated gap financing structure that we have here. I will say, when it comes to gap financing, some of this money might be grants, some of it might be debt. Typically speaking, gap financing debt is going to be what's called soft debt, meaning that it only gets paid to the extent that there is cash flow that is available. So, needless to say, for lenders that are providing soft debt, the fact that they won't be getting a hard debt service payment makes this kind of financing extremely competitive, but it is what makes our transactions actually work. It's what really truly greases the skids to get the transaction financeable. In this particular transaction, Arlington County, through the AHIF program, provided a little over $7 million. As part of that financing, they also required that AHC, the developer, put in money into the transaction as well. And that's where the AHC sponsor loan, we actually put money into the deal as a complementary piece to the AHIF money. Okay, so now we're getting a little bit closer to filling the gap here. As it turns out, Arlington County, with this TOHA, this is transit-oriented money. By virtue of where this property is located, we were able to access some soft funds as it related. Actually, if I remember correctly, this is actually grant dollars, but they were available to us, which, again, another contribution to filling the gap. Let me talk to the Virginia Housing Trust Fund. Again, this is another source of soft funds that was applied for along with the low-income housing tax credits during that process, which is, again, another gap filler. The AHC seller note, this was, again, another contribution that AHC made to the transaction in order to close the gap. And this was a note that we took back as it related to the purchase of the land. And then lastly, the deferred development fee. Again, if we go down into the source, or I'm sorry, the uses, we see the development fee is $2.8 million. Well, in order to completely close the gap, what we ended up doing is deferring a piece of our development fee into the deal that closed the gap. And in order, there are bells and whistles that go along with development fee and how development fee ultimately gets paid. And this goes back to a conversation about basis. We end up getting basis at, or development fee is part of basis that generates tax credits. But in order, given the fact that we're now deferring some of the development fee, it means that in order for that basis to be justified in delivering credits, that development fee does have to be paid. So in theory, the development fee, that $918,000 will need to get paid out over the 15-year life of this transaction in order for our basis to be validated as it relates to the tax credits. I recognize every single time when I talk about affordable housing and tax credits, there are so many nuances to the program that it's kind of hard to comprehend in just a 45-minute presentation. But hopefully it's driving home the point that the work is not easy. It is not simple. It is rarely done on a completely linear way. Real estate development, to a large degree, it tends to be 2 steps forward, 1 step back, 3 steps forward, 2 steps back. And that's just sort of the nature of affordable housing development. Josh, if you could go back to the timeline, please. So on the timeline, I just want to point out a few other quick things on the timeline before we actually get into the income statement and then the actual structure of the tenant base. So we got the tax credit award in 2020. Between the tax credit award and 2020, it took probably 9 months to actually get to the closing table, which was in the middle part of 2021. I will say, when you get to the closing table, everyone's got to remember that that is just the start of the project. That's where all your sources and uses have been agreed to, your income and expenses have all been agreed to, all the financing documents have been done, the zoning's done, all the approvals are done. Everything has come together on the day of closing. The way that I describe sort of that period between 2018 and 2021, when you actually get to a closing, is if you think of development as an equation, it's an equation that's got 500 variables in it. And as you push down on one variable, another variable will go up. And over the period from 2018 to 2021, the closing, you see the equation going like this. And on the day of closing, everything is in balance. Sources and uses, all the documents, everything is good to go. But there you're then at the starting line. So you get to closing, then you got to get the project constructed. I had mentioned earlier, architects, engineers, the general contractor is a critical component to the development team. Part of the push me, pull me of the process of underwriting. Oftentimes a project is designed, and ultimately the design ends up having a project that's going to cost too much when you go to your general contractor, who then prices it all out. So then you go through a process of value engineering. So we're going to cut out this and this. So then the price comes down. And then over time, again, we're talking, 2.5 years, inflation occurs. But ultimately, when you get to the day of closing, in theory, everything, not in theory, in actuality, everything is balanced. Construction then commences. The critical piece of construction in any kind of real estate development is that it happens on time and on budget. And for all the work that we do in preparation to get to closing, agreeing on what the budget is and agreeing on what the timeline is, oftentimes that doesn't always play out that way. There's a whole process of change orders that potentially could increase the cost of a transaction. It's also possible that it could decrease it, but that's rare that happens. Ideally, or not ideally, there is a timeline on which you're expected to construct the project, which all goes into the calculus of a construction loan and how much interest you have. I'll just make a basic statement that in affordable housing real estate, time is money. So the expectation is that, it's going to take 18 months to get constructed. Once you get the property constructed, ideally it's been done on time and on budget, then you got to get it leased up. The lease up process will start anywhere from 3 to 6 months prior to the project actually being delivered. You're going to bring in your property management company that's going to do marketing. Ultimately, the day we get what's called a temporary certificate of occupancy, you start the process of getting people into the building. There will be a particular time frame that we underwrite in order to lease up the building to achieve what is called qualified occupancy, which means that all of the units are occupied by folks that qualify for those units. Once you've achieved that, then the next piece that we talk about is permanent loan conversion. So you get to qualified occupancy. Ideally, you have 100% of your building leased. You start operations. You get to the point of stabilization, which means that your revenues covering your operating expenses. That is underwritten by virtue of work with the lender. And ultimately, you then pay off the construction loan and you put in place that permanent loan that will amortize over the life of the transaction. In our particular instance here, it was in 2023 that construction completion was happened. As it turns out, there was a snafu with the HAP agreement. While it was agreed to up front, as it turns out, the actual issuance of a new HAP agreement took a little bit longer than anticipated, which meant that our lease up was a little bit slower than anticipated, which has now delayed the conversion to the permanent loan. As it turns out, fingers crossed, that's going to happen this week. That basically brings the development aspect of a transaction to a close when you've converted your permanent mortgage. After you've done that, the life of a tax credit is 15 years. Again, I mentioned that tax credits are delivered over a 10-year period, but the actual hold period for a low-income housing tax credit is 15 years. So this is the income statement. And I had mentioned to you that in determining what your first mortgage is, this is the way that we go about determining the actual operating economics for a transaction. Rents are what they are. We have 77 units. We have multiple different AMIs that we are leasing to at this particular project. In the collective, the total rents are approximately $1.4 million in total rents. Whenever you underwrite real estate, you always have to underwrite vacancy, which is an underwriting idea that you're not going to necessarily collect every single penny that you're allowed to. Typically speaking, underwriting vacancy is at 5%. Certainly in this market, it's going to be 5%. In a lot of jurisdictions, it's actually 7%. But given the strength of the Washington, D.C. metro area, we typically underwrite to a 5% vacancy. Operating expenses are, what does it cost to actually run the facility? Got to pay administration, payroll, management fees, utilities, operations and maintenance, insurance, and tax, real estate taxes. Over the last several years, operating expenses have gone up pretty dramatically. Payrolls are far higher, just general inflation. Insurance has been hammered in the last several years. Operating expenses are one of the challenges in underwriting. Oftentimes, jurisdictions, the individual states that have qualified allocation plans, they will put caps on what operating expenses could be, which makes it very difficult when it's one thing for somebody to underwrite at whatever $6,500 a unit, but when you're at $8,500 a unit, because that's what the reality is, it makes it challenging to figure out how to navigate that. In this particular instance, we have the net revenue of almost 1.5 million, operating expenses of 874. And I would say that the presentation here, the replacement reserves should actually be added to the total operating expenses, which is going to reduce the net operating income, because that's the way that a lender is going to underwrite the debt service coverage. Ultimately, the debt service coverage is going to be underwritten to a 115 debt service. And a 115 debt service means that you've got that little bit of space between revenues and operating expenses. So that's what the 115 will do for you. You're going to have a little bit of a delta between the net operating income and the debt service that you pay, and ultimately there will be some cash flow that gets distributed, limited though it is. Okay, real quick, if we can hit the tenant base in the next slide. So the unit mix here at Terraces is pretty complicated. And I will say that this is not wildly unusual. Sort of the nature of affordable housing these days is like when I first started doing low-income housing tax credit deals, most of the deals that I saw were underwritten all at 60% AMI. Over time, we've been reducing or digging deeper into the AMIs. So in this particular project, we have 30% AMI, 50% AMI, and 60% AMI. AMI, again, is area median income. So we are going pretty deep into the AMI, meaning that we're touching more low income versus moderate income members of the community. You can also see that, we have efficiencies, 1 and 2 bedroom units. And then the note down at the bottom, it goes to some of the subsidies that we have in the project. We have what is called housing assistance payment, also known as project-based Section 8. We have 30 units that are subsidized through the HAP. We have 8 units that are designed specifically for permanent supportive housing. These are folks that typically have more supportive needs, and they are actually being funded through a local rent subsidy. So we have 8 Arlington permanent supportive housing units. We have 8 units, and this is, bear with me, these are specific accessible units that needed to be designed into the project. There is no special subsidy that goes along with that. And then lastly, there is the Virginia DBHS is actually a preference for certain units for folks that have specific behavioral issues that the facility will accommodate as part of the tenants, part of the tenant mix. So let's see if you can go to the last slide. All right. So we covered a lot of ground there. I'm hoping that at least in the presentation, you got a flavor for the process, the time, the level of complexity, looking at sources and uses and the way that sources and uses have to kind of match up. The tenant base, the sort of the timeline, and some of the challenges that go along with the timeline. So I'm going to stop and we'll open it up for a few questions. I don't know if you get a sense of it, but I really enjoy doing this work. I love the work that we do. We need to produce a lot more housing than we are today. The demand far outstrips the supply. So anything that we can do to facilitate more housing in our community here, as well as everywhere in the country, I strongly encourage everybody to get involved. So let's answer some questions.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you, Ken. So much covered, right? And we could stay on probably for another couple hours, but we're going to do some like rapid fire questions that we had in the chat. If anybody wants to raise their hand, if you have another question, we'll call on you. But one question was if you can talk about the long-term ground leases versus acquisition costs, especially for church-owned properties. I know AHC has done partnerships with churches on this development, if there's any cost savings or how you evaluate that, I guess, in a deal and planning for the financing.
Well, I will say, and I might ask Alan to pop in on this one a little bit. But, a ground lease is another tool that we can use to what a ground lease really does is it allows the lessor to basically control the ground underneath a facility, such that at some point in the future, the expectation would be that the land as well as the improvements ultimately go to the lessor. There typically will be an underwriting that is done to assess some type of value. Oftentimes similar to an outright sale, there may be a payment that's made up front in order to compensate the lessor, or it's also possible that you could have a lease payment over time. Given the challenging economics of a lot of affordable housing, again, going back to this piece here, the amount of revenue and operating expenses and NOI that a project generates is going to be relatively limited for lease payments over time. So most lease structures that I've been a part of have had a payment up front to compensate the church, for instance, for the value of the land in some size, shape, or form. But I will say that's also one of the things I mentioned early on about land cost. Given the challenging economics of the sources and uses piece, to the extent that we can get land at a lower basis, it makes the financing of the project easier.
Great, thank you so much. Another question about working with smaller development or developers and how they rely on their developer fee to sustain them and try to assist them with their next project. And if you talk about the trade-offs of deferring the fee from an organizational standpoint, because AHC's been doing this for 50 years.
Right. I mean, organizationally speaking, ideally, again, when you think about the timeline, the idea of giving up fee it's almost I will say, just as a developer that's done both for-profit and not-for-profit real estate development work, I mean, that's how you get paid. So the idea of deferring fee is I think it's challenging for an organization to do that. That being said, there are a number of programs that incentivize an organization to defer fee. You can be more competitive on your tax credit application. There may be soft funds that require you to put money into the transaction through deferred development fee. So it's the kind of thing that you've got to be conscious of, and you've got to think about it up front as you're doing your sources and uses, to recognize that you may not be getting 100% of your development fee. I will say with a smaller organization, overhead is less. I know there are a number of for-profit real estate development shops that do affordable housing, but they tend to be there's big guys that are out there, but the big guys have lots of overhead. I would suggest that the smaller shops that have less overhead have the ability to keep the lights on and pay themselves appropriately, even if they're deferring fees. So
great, thank you. We have a question. Bob has a question. Bob, do you want to go off mute to ask your question?
Yeah, my question is related to sources and uses. The land price seems to be like approximately 2.3 million
yep.
or something like that. And then there's a sponsor loan of 1.7, and then there's a seller note at 700,000. What was the rationale for the sponsor loan? Because it seemed like the seller note could have just been equal to the combination of the two.
Well, first off, on the land itself, we let me get the numbers again. 2.3 was bear with me. 2.3 was the agreed upon acquisition price.
It was the appraised value. Yeah.
I'm sorry, the appraised value.
Can we go back to the sources and uses tab?
I'm sorry, what was the question?
I wanted to see if we could see the sources and uses tab, I think the presentation is gone though. Never mind.
Sure, we can do that.
Recognize we have one more minute left.
Okay, so the land price was just real quick. The land price was 2.3. There was a piece of debt that had to be paid off on the land, which was $1.6 million. So then the seller's note basically made up the gap there.
Got it. That makes sense.
Yeah.
It's for tax credits. If you acquire land for less than it's valued, you have to do a seller note trick or some kind of paper so that it doesn't look like it's a grant that triggers taxable liability, which would erase the purpose of your tax credit.
Okay, that makes sense. I think the key fact that I missed was the fact that there was debt on the property, so you didn't get the full value of the land at closing.
Well, we did not put money in our pockets by virtue of this land sale. That is correct. Yes, that is correct. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you so much. I know that there's so many more questions and this topic is extensive. So we are already planning to kind of do a follow-up to make sure we can have the questions that you pre-submitted answered, as well as some of the others in the chat we didn't get to. I'm sure there's many more. I just want to thank so much for AHC and especially Ken and Josh and Alan for being willing to kind of open up and share about their project. These are very competitive processes. All of our developers are competing for resources, and just appreciate you all shedding a little bit of light on this complicated work that you do, this important work that you do. And we will be back in touch. We will share the recording, some of the slides, and really appreciate, again, AHC for your willingness to help us out.